The cicadas sang low in the heat of the summer dusk, their voices echoing through the crooked streets of an old, American village that time itself seemed reluctant to let go of. The village was small, hidden in the folds of dusty hills and cottonwood. Trees, where porches leaned under the weight of rocking chairs and lantern lights spilled onto cracked sidewalks. It was the kind of place where secrets traveled slowly, yet never died, whispered over fences and across wooden counters in the general store. And it was here, in this quiet place caught between tradition and change, that a forbidden story began to unfold, one that would alter a young woman's life forever. Her name was Apache, a girl with eyes as restless as the river that curved past the edge of town. Though her family had lived there for generations, she often felt like she didn't belong, like her spirit pulled at something beyond the cornfields and chapel bells. She moved through the village with a quiet grace, but people noticed her difference, the way she lingered at the edge of conversations, how her thoughts seemed to travel further than her words ever did. Neighbors watched her kindly, but also carefully, as though they sensed she carried something unspoken inside her. She was expected to live the life the town had carved out long before her, a path of predictability, but destiny rarely respects such plans. Every story of forbidden love begins with an encounter, often as ordinary as a passing glance. For Apache, it happened one late afternoon while she was carrying a basket of laundry back from the creek. The air was thick with the smell of wild grass and wood smoke. That's when she noticed him, her neighbor. He had been living there only a short while on a piece of land his family recently acquired. His presence in the village was still new enough to stir quiet gossip. People wondered about his past, where he came from, why he preferred solitude over gatherings. He carried himself with the ruggedness of someone who had seen more of the world than most men in that valley. And though his silence unsettled some, it drew her like a magnet. Apache told herself not to look too long, not to allow curiosity to stretch into something dangerous. But that moment, the simple act of her eyes meeting his was like a spark, flaring against dry tinder. She felt it in her chest, sharp and undeniable, though she quickly lowered her gaze and walked on, her heart beat louder than the cicadas. The village had rules, unspoken but powerful. A woman like her was expected to choose someone familiar, someone safe, not a man whose history was a mystery, whose presence stirred unease. Yet something inside her knew this meeting was the beginning of something she could not stop. In the days that followed, their paths crossed again and again. Sometimes by chance, other times because fate seemed to weave their steps closer. She saw him mending fences, his hands rough with work yet careful in every movement. She glimpsed him at the old churchyard, standing quiet as though listening to the wind. Once, when a summer storm burst suddenly across the valley, she found herself sheltering beneath the same awning as him, their shoulders inches apart, the rain thrumming like drums all around. Neither spoke much, but silence between them was never empty, it carried weight, promise, and a danger she did not yet dare name. At night, Apache lay awake listening to the creak of her grandmother's rocking chair in the next room, the steady rhythm of a home rooted in tradition. But her mind wandered to him. She thought of the way his eyes held something she recognized, a loneliness that mirrored her own. It frightened her, how quickly her thoughts slipped toward him, how natural it felt despite every warning echoing in her head. The old ways of the village taught her to stay within boundaries, to obey the quiet map drawn out for women like her. Yet her heart was sketching a different path, one she had no control over. The whispers began sooner than she expected. In a town where even the sound of a screen door closing could turn into talk, people noticed her glances, his silence, the way the two seemed to exist in an invisible orbit. Women at the well-exchanged knowing looks. Men on the porch of the general store nodded toward his name. It was nothing spoken directly to her, but she felt the weight of their eyes, the heavy press of judgment. She knew what they thought, that curiosity could grow into temptation, that temptation could turn into shame. Still, no matter how hard she tried, she could not stop the way her heart leapt whenever she saw him walking the dusty road that ran between their homes. As summer deepened, the village prepared for its annual harvest gathering, a tradition older than the bricks in the church walls. It was the one night when the whole community came together, with music, food, and dancing under lanterns strung across the square. Apache was expected to attend, to smile politely, to accept the hand of whichever young man asked her to dance. But her mind was elsewhere, caught between duty and the pull of something far more dangerous. She knew he would be there, whether on the edge of the crowd or watching from the shadows, and the thought of it made her chest ache with both dread and longing. On the night of the gathering, the square glowed with lantern light, laughter spilling into the warm air. Fiddles played, boots struck the earth in rhythm, and children darted between tables laden with cornbread and cider. Apache wore a simple dress, her grandmother's necklace resting against her collarbone, a reminder of the life expected of her. She smiled when spoken to, nodded when introduced, yet her eyes searched the crowd for only one face. And when she finally found him, standing apart at the edge of the square, the world seemed to still around her. Their eyes met across the distance. And in that moment, she knew the path she chose tonight would change everything. She felt the weight of tradition pressing hard on her shoulders. But she also felt something else: freedom, possibility, the dangerous sweetness of love not meant to be spoken. The music swelled, people danced, laughter rose higher, but all she could hear was the thunder of her own heartbeat. She took a step toward him, small but defiant, as though her entire life had been leading to this choice. Yet before she could reach him, before she could even breathe his name, a voice from the crowd called out sharply, breaking the fragile spell. And in that instant, with every eye in the village turning toward her, she realized the forbidden line had been crossed. What came next would not only test her courage, but reshape her future in ways she could not yet imagine. The sharp voice that cut across the square seemed to echo louder than the fiddle strings, louder even than the laughter that hung in the air. Apache froze where she stood, her breath locked in her chest. For a moment, the entire village seemed to turn its attention to her, though no one spoke outright. The call had been directed toward her, yet it was not what was said, but how it was said, curt, commanding, carrying the weight of expectation that made her cheeks burn. She lowered her eyes quickly, as though by doing so she could make herself invisible again. But deep down, she knew the moment could not be undone. Something had shifted in the way the villagers saw her, and in the way she now saw herself. Night went on, lanterns swaying in the warm breeze, voices carrying songs and stories, yet Apache felt distant from it all. She forced herself to join the dance once, her hand taken by a young man whose smile was polite but hollow. She moved in rhythm because that was what was asked of her. But her thoughts drifted again and again toward the edge of the square. Remained there, the neighbor whose presence stirred questions she was not ready to answer. His gaze never wavered, though he gave no sign, no word, only the quiet strength of someone who understood the risk of being seen. When the dance ended, Apache stepped away quickly, her heart trembling with the weight of what might come next. In the weeks that followed, the village returned to its steady rhythm. Days began early, with the smell of bread rising from kitchens, and the sound of horses clopping along the dirt road. Yet beneath the surface, whispers lingered. Apache felt them like a cold draft in every room she entered. Women at the market measured their words more carefully when she approached. Men tipped their hats, but with eyes that carried questions they did not voice. Her grandmother, wise and watchful, said little, but Apache noticed the way her eyes studied her more intently than before, as if searching for answers in her silence. Apache herself lived with a storm inside. She knew the rules of her world, the boundaries etched into her life long before she was born. But she also knew what it meant to feel alive in a way she never had before. It frightened her, the strength of her own longing, yet it also gave her a sense of purpose. Every time she passed her neighbor's land, she felt the pull again. She saw him working quietly with the soil, tending to the fences, carrying water from the well. Simple things, yet she noticed the steadiness in his movements, the patience in his solitude. There was a story behind his silence, one she was desperate to understand, even if it meant stepping into dangerous ground. Late one evening, when the sun sank low and painted the sky in streaks of copper and gold, Apache found herself at the edge of the river. The water ran smooth, reflecting the dying light, and she sat on a rock with her skirt gathered around her. She came here often when her thoughts grew heavy, for the river had a way of carrying burdens downstream. But on that night, she was not alone. She heard footsteps on the gravel and turned to see him. He did not approach quickly, nor did he speak right away. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, as if waiting for her to decide whether he was welcome. For the first time, words passed between them. They were simple, almost ordinary, a comment about the river's beauty, a question about the day's work. Yet in the spaces between their sentences was an entire world of meaning. Apache felt the air shift around her, charged with something that was both frightening and thrilling. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who chose words with care. And she listened, drawn not only to his presence but to the quiet honesty in his tone. That evening ended with silence, the kind that lingers not because nothing is left to say, but because too much has been said without speaking. After that night, Apache's world changed. She found herself seeking him, though never openly. Their meetings were never planned, yet they seemed inevitable, passing each other on the road, sharing a glance at the edge of the fields, or exchanging brief words when no one else was near. Each encounter built on the last, weaving a bond that neither dared name. Yet with every step closer, the danger grew. The village was small, and eyes were everywhere. A woman's choices were not her own but belonged to the community, measured against tradition and honor. Apache knew this better than anyone, yet her heart betrayed her again and again. Her grandmother sensed it too. One evening, while they sat together in the dim glow of the oil lamp, the older woman spoke in a voice low but firm. She did not name him, yet her meaning was clear. She reminded Apache of duty, of family, of the path already laid for her. She spoke of sacrifice and of the weight a woman must carry for the sake of her people. Apache listened, her throat tight with unspoken words. She wanted to tell her grandmother about the ache in her chest, about the way life felt different now. Fuller, brighter, more dangerous. But she remained silent, knowing such confessions would break more than trust. They would break her place in the only world she had ever known. The neighbor himself remained a mystery. Though Apache learned small details, his fondness for the river, his quiet strength in the fields, she knew little of his past. The village spoke in fragments, stories half told and questions unanswered. Some said he had come from far away, leaving behind troubles best forgotten. Others claimed he carried secrets too heavy to share. To Apache, none of that mattered as much as the way he looked at her, not with the eyes of someone judging or expecting, but with the recognition of someone who truly saw her. And yet, the less she knew, the more dangerous her feelings became. For mystery has a way of binding hearts tighter than truth. As autumn crept into the valley, the air grew cooler, and the fields turned golden with harvest. The village prepared for another season of hard work, gathering crops and storing food for the long winter ahead. But beneath the surface of daily life, Apache's world grew more complicated. The whispers had not faded. If anything, they grew sharper. she noticed neighbors watching her more closely, as if waiting for her to slip. The young man who had danced with her at the gathering began to visit more often, encouraged by families eager to see her settle into a proper match. Apache forced herself to smile, to listen politely, to act as though nothing stirred inside her. But every moment felt heavier, every smile more difficult to hold. The tension grew until it seemed to follow her everywhere. Each step she took felt like walking along a line stretched thin, ready to snap at the slightest misstep. At night, she dreamed of choices paths that branched in opposite directions, each demanding a sacrifice. In one, she remained as she was, safe within the embrace of her community, but forever silent in her heart. In the other, she followed the dangerous pull toward him, risking shame, risking everything. She woke from these dreams with her chest aching, her mind racing, and no answers in sight. One evening, as the first chill of autumn settled over the village, Apache returned from the fields later than usual. The sky was already deep with twilight, the stars beginning to pierce through. As she neared the edge of her land, she saw him again. He stood near the fence line, his figure outlined by the fading light. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand in a quiet greeting. It was nothing more than a simple gesture, but it carried with it a weight she could not ignore. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, knowing that this choice, this single step, would carry her further down a path she might never turn back from. Behind her, she could almost hear the echoes of her grandmother's voice, the murmur of neighbors, the heavy silence of tradition pressing against her. Before her, the unknown stretched wide, both terrifying and beautiful. She did not know what secrets he carried, nor how the village would respond if the truth of her feelings ever came to light. All she knew was that she could no longer deny the pull inside her, the forbidden thread that bound her to him. And as the stars brightened above the village that night, Apache understood that her life was already changing, whether she was ready for it or not. What waited beyond that moment would test her heart in ways she had never imagined. The night after she stepped toward the fence, Apache woke before dawn and lit the lamp with careful hands. The old boards of the house answered with soft creaks. Her grandmother stirred in the next room and asked if she could not sleep. Apache said she had chores to start early. The lie felt small and heavy at the same time. She pulled on her boots and walked out while the sky was still gray. The river was a dark ribbon, the cornfields a silent army. She hoped the quiet would quiet her heart too, but it only made space for more questions. What did he carry that kept him apart? Why did the village watch him as if he were a storm on the far hills? Why did she feel stronger and more frightened every time she looked his way? Down by the willow, she found a tin lunch pail hung on the fence post. It was not hers. Inside lay a slice of bread wrapped in cloth and a note folded twice. There was no name, only a few words in a steady hand. Thank you for the kindness of listening. I will not trouble you. If you need help with the west fence, leave the red bandana on the post. Apache read it twice and pressed the paper flat again. He did not sign it, but she felt the truth of it just the same. She kept the bread for her grandmother and tucked the note under her skirt band. Then she looked at the post a long time and did not leave a bandana. Not yet. By afternoon, the village moved like a wheel. The forge sang, the church bell rang small reminders, the general store smelled of coffee and burlap. Apache went in to buy flour and a spool of thread. The shopkeeper watched her with that kind of slow look that reaches past your skin to the story inside you. He asked after her grandmother and mentioned that a few village elders would meet that evening, about harvest schedules and water rights. He said the river was running lower than last year and folks were nervous. As Apache counted coins, she heard two women near the pickle barrel talk about a stray horse found by the neighbor's fence line. They used his name in a tone that dressed a rumor as a fact. Apache left with her head low. On the porch she stood still a moment and listened to the crickets starting up even before sunset. There was always a noise in this village that sounded like concern wearing a friendly face. When she reached the house, her grandmother was shelling beans. She patted the bench beside her and asked about the store. Apache sat and kept her voice steady. Her grandmother talked of the elders' meeting and said they might ask Apache to bring bread to the chapel as a peace offering because people listen better when their mouths are full. Then her grandmother's voice changed. She said a woman in a town like this must carry 2 baskets. One holds what she wants. The other holds what is good for everyone. Sometimes a day comes when the baskets feel too heavy. Apache leaned her head on the old woman's shoulder. She wished she could stay in that spot and let time pass around them like wind through leaves. But the neighbor's note burned warm against her skin. The elders gathered in the chapel at dusk. Apache brought bread, set it down, and tried to leave. One of the men asked her to stay to help pour cider. She stood near the front and watched faces she had known since she was a child. The talk began with water, turned to fences, turned to the horse, turned to troubles no one could name. Then the shopkeeper cleared his throat and said they ought to decide what to do about outsiders who did not join the community for worship or work parties. He did not use the neighbor's name, yet everyone heard it. The pastor lifted a hand, calm but firm, and said no one should be judged without cause. A farmer spoke next and said that strange tools had been seen by the river and that sometimes trouble follows new ways. Apache felt her pulse in her throat. She imagined standing up and telling them the neighbor had done nothing wrong. She imagined saying his silence was softer than the gossip in this room. She did not move. When the meeting ended, the pastor found her outside. He said her bread had softened some hard words. He asked if she had seen the tools by the river. She said no. His eyes were kind but searching. He told her the village was not a jail and also not a wild plain. It was a small thing held by many careful hands. He said to carry both baskets with care. Apache nodded and walked home slow. She thought of the red bandana in the west fence and the water that might run too low to save the fields. At dawn, she left the bandana. When she returned at noon, the bandana was gone and the top rail of the west fence had been replaced with straight cedar. A simple thing, quiet and strong. That night, when the stars were sharp and the air thin with cold, she found him near the willow. He kept his distance, and she kept hers. He told her he used to work on survey crews that mapped lands far from here, and that he owned tools no one in town had seen. He said those tools were not for greed, only for understanding the ground under their feet. He said the river had shifted, that a sandbar upstream would choke the flow by winter. He had placed a simple rod in the shallows to watch the depths change. That was the strange tool. He asked her to tell the pastor, not to defend him, only to save the harvest. Apache said she would try. When he turned to leave, she called him back and asked if he had family. He looked past her at the chapel steeple and said once. He did not say more. The next day Apache went to the chapel and told the pastor about the sandbar and the rod. They walked to the river and he studied the marker in the water and the way the current curled. He did not speak for a long time. At last he said that if a neighbor was right, the mill would slow and the fields would suffer. He said that moving a sandbar takes hands and shovels and trust. Then he smiled a thin, tired smile and said trust was the rarest of the three. He promised to talk to the elders if Apache would bring the neighbor to meet him in daylight at the river. She agreed, then felt the weight of what she had agreed to. The general store grew busier as the harvest drew near. The young man who had danced with her started stopping by her gate with small gifts. Apples. A handful of bright marbles he said he had won in a contest as a boy. A carved bird no bigger than her thumb. He was kind in a way that would be easy to accept. But she saw how carefully he measured her expressions and how he glanced at the neighbor's land when he thought she did not notice. One afternoon he said the elders would soon decide who would lead the waterwork if there was trouble and that he might be chosen. Apache thanked him and felt the space between politeness and honesty open like a crack in dry soil. He asked if he might walk her to the river on Sunday. She told him she had other tasks. His face fell and he nodded like someone who adds a small stone to a pile and pretends not to feel the weight. Gossip took on a new shape when a crate went missing from the back of the store. It was a crate of spare parts for farm tools and a cast iron pump handle. The shopkeeper counted shelves and found nothing out of place except that one gap. He told the elders, and the elders told the farmers, and the farmers told their wives. And by evening the only person not named who might have done it was the neighbor. Apache felt anger rise, clean and hot. She went to the willow at dusk and waited. When he came, she asked him straight. He shook his head, calm and steady. He said he had tools of his own and no use for parts that did not fit them. He said he would come meet the pastor at noon the next day if she felt safe with that. She said she did. Noon came bright and blue. The pastor stood by the water with his sleeves rolled and his boots in the shallows. The neighbor came from across the field and stopped a few paces back. For a while they spoke of the river as if it were a living thing rather than an argument. The pastor asked questions about flow and depth and the bend where the sandbar had formed. The neighbor answered with words that were plain and useful. Together they built a small crib of stones to shift the current an inch. The pastor watched the surface change and nodded. Then 3 men from the elders walked up, surprise on their faces. They looked at the stones, at the rod in the water, at the 2 men standing side by side. One of them asked why the neighbor thought he knew more than the men who had farmed here all their lives. The neighbor said he knew nothing beyond what water and tools had taught him. The pastor said it might be wise to listen. The elders said they would meet again that night and closed their words like doors. Apache walked home with her hands clenched. She knew what it meant for a woman to speak up in that room. Yet the picture of the sandbar would not leave her. That evening she stood in the doorway while her grandmother tended the stove. She told the old woman everything. The note, the fence, the river, the pastor. Her grandmother did not interrupt. When Apache finished, the old woman wiped her hands and took down a worn family Bible. From between the pages she drew a folded map of the valley, thin as onion skin. She said a great flood had come long before Apache was born, and their people had moved to Sandbar with shovels and prayer. She traced the river with her finger and said the land remembers. Then she told Apache to keep the map safe and to be careful. In rooms where men were afraid of both water and change. The missing crate was found too, days later in a barn at the far end of town. A boy had stashed it there for reasons he would not explain. No one came to the neighbor to apologize. The story thinned and drifted away like smoke, yet the harm had done its work. People now watched for the next mistake that might carry his shape. The young man who visited Apache grew sharper in his questions. He asked if she believed the neighbor could change the river. He asked if she had met him alone. He asked if she would stand with him, the young man, at the fall festival where couples pledged to help one another through winter. Apache said she could not promise anything. He left with his jaw tight and his hat brim low. Work began on the sandbar at last, not as a united force but as 2 groups. The pastor led a handful of families who trusted his judgment. They took shovels and planks and worked in the mornings when the light was good. The elders allowed it but set rules, and one of the rules said that outsiders could not lead. The neighbor came at dawn and left before the larger crowd arrived. He would set the angle of a plank or place a stone where the water bucked and then step back so that none could say he commanded the river or the men. Apache helped carry boards and passed bread along the bank. She watched how the current shifted around the work they did. She felt a quiet hope rise each time the water turned a little more. She also felt the eyes on her back. In the midst of all of this, her grandmother fell ill with a fever that would not break. Nights became long. The house smelled of herbs and damp cloth. Apache sat by the bedside and read aloud from old letters and hymns. Word spread, and the pastor came with tea, and the shopkeeper's wife brought broth. And even the young man left a jar of honey by the door. At dusk one day, a parcel arrived wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a hand-carved cross and a note that said, "For strength, no name, steady hand." Apache set the cross by the lamp and felt tears gather. She prayed for the fever to lift and for a path through the thicket that her life had become. When the fever eased at last, her grandmother slept deep and woke with a soft smile. She squeezed Apache's hand and said, "The baskets are heavy, but you were meant to carry them." Then she slept again. Apache stepped outside to breathe and saw smoke far beyond the mill, not black like a fire, but gray and thin. She walked toward it with a knot in her stomach. Along the way she met the young man who said the elders had called for a vote about the water work. He said if the vote went poorly, all work at the river must stop. He said that if Apache stood with him in front of the room, it might soften the outcome. His eyes were pleading and hard at the same time. Apache said she would not stand as a symbol for any side, but would speak truth if asked. He pressed his lips thin and told her she would regret losing him as an ally. She watched him walk away and felt the air cool further. At the mill, the smoke rose from a small fire in a metal barrel. The neighbor stood near it, warming his hands. He said the mornings were colder now and the river would soon decide who had been wise. Apache told him about the vote. He nodded as if he had expected it. He said he could leave if it would ease things. He could take his tools and go west again. Apache felt something inside her claw for purchase. She asked him not to run. She said running would give shape to lies. He looked at her then in a way that fixed her to the earth. He said he would stay if she asked him to. She opened her mouth and found no words, only the sound of water moving fast over stones. The vote was set for that night in the chapel hall. Lanterns would swing. Voices would rise. Apache would carry her grandmother's map in her skirt pocket. The pastor would speak of river truth and human fear. The young man would count each nod as a step toward his own standing. The neighbor would remain near the door, ready to go if the room turned. The village would gather, old and new faces lit in the same gold glow. A bell would ring to call order. Someone would bring a crate of apples and a plate of bread to keep anger from drying out the mouth. As the sun slid behind the hills, Apache stood on the chapel steps and felt the boards beneath her shoes. She knew the story had entered a place where every breath mattered. She thought of her grandmother's 2 baskets. She thought of the map and the sandbar and the quiet strength of a fence rail set straight without asking for thanks. She thought of the weight of a word spoken in a small room. She did not know which way the vote would fall or what the river would look like come winter. She only knew the door would open soon and she would have to walk through it. The hinges squealed and the room stilled, and every face turned toward her as she stepped inside. The chapel smelled of cedar oil and smoke, and the heat of too many bodies pressed against the walls. Apache stepped inside with the map tucked into her skirt, and the hum of voices faltered as though her presence had stolen the air from the room. The elders sat at the long table near the pulpit, their faces set in stone. The pastor stood beside them, calm but weary, his hand resting on the Bible like it anchored him to steadiness. Lantern light wavered, shadows climbing up the beams. Every chair was filled, every window crowded with the silhouettes of those who could not fit inside, but would not miss what was to come. The young man who had once danced with her was near the front, his hat in his lap, his posture sharp with restless energy. His eyes found hers, and there was something both pleading and accusing in them. Behind him, the shopkeeper whispered into the ear of another elder, and their low tones sounded more like plotting than conversation. Apache did not move far. She stood near the back, her heart beating so loud she feared it would betray her thoughts. And near the door, just as he promised, the neighbor remained half in shadow, as if one step could carry him away from it all. The meeting began with the pastor reminding everyone why they had gathered. The sandbar, the water, the harvest. He spoke of the work already done, of how families had bent their backs at the river and shifted stones. He did not name who had guided the first steps, but his eyes flickered toward the neighbor, and that was enough to stir the room. Murmurs rose, like wind through dreary grass. One elder cleared his throat and said that tradition kept them safe, that no outside hand should ever lead where their fathers had once stood. Another said that if they ignored the warnings, the fields might dry and the mill would fail, and then tradition would not fill their stomachs. The debate swelled, each word sharper than the last. Voices cracked with frustration, and the lantern flames seemed to jump in rhythm with their anger. Some called for patience, others for action. Then the shopkeeper stood and said aloud what many had only whispered. He asked how they could trust a man whose past they did not know, who carried tools no one else understood, who walked alone at the edges of their world. His voice was steady, but the edges were jagged with suspicion. He turned and pointed toward the neighbor at the door, and the weight of every eye followed. The neighbor did not flinch. He only stepped forward into the light, his face lined with quiet endurance. He said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch until the tension was nearly unbearable. Then he spoke plainly. He told them he had come from far lands where rivers had destroyed towns when their warnings were ignored. He told them he had no family left, that loss had driven him to wander, and that he had settled here not to lead but to live. He said his tools were not weapons but lessons written in metal and wood. He did not ask for trust. He only asked that they watch the river with their own eyes and decide for themselves what truth it told. For a moment the room softened, but then the young man stood, his voice quick with urgency. He said that the neighbor's words were clever, but cleverness could hide danger. He spoke of loyalty, of protecting their way of life, of how trust must be earned through years, not through stones placed in a stream. His eyes darted to Apache, sharp as flint, and he asked the room who had spent time alone with the stranger. His words hung heavy, and a rustle moved through the crowd. Apache felt her chest tighten, heat crawling up her neck. She knew they waited for her to speak, to deny, to defend. She did not step forward. Instead, the pastor spoke again, his voice stronger now. He said that suspicion without proof was poison, and that fear of difference was no shield against hardship. But his words could not smother the fire. One elder demanded a vote that night. Another insisted they delay until more could be learned, and the noise grew until the chapel walls seemed to vibrate with it. Apache clutched the map in her skirt pocket, her fingers trembling. She thought of her grandmother's warning of carrying 2 baskets, and knew that one of them would soon tip dot. When at last the voices dimmed, the elders agreed that the vote would be held before dawn. They would meet again with the rising sun to decide whether the work at the river would continue or whether all efforts would cease and the sandbar be left to fate. The crowd spilled into the cool night air, voices still sharp, faces set with anger or fear or doubt. Apache lingered on the steps, the map burning against her skin. The young man brushed past her, his shoulder striking hers harder than needed, and he muttered that silence was as guilty as confession. She did not answer. Later she found herself at the willow, the moon casting the river in silver light. The neighbor was there, his posture heavy but unbroken. He asked if she would speak for him at the vote. She looked at the water, at the shifting current, and said she did not know if words from her lips would change anything. He told her the river would not wait for fear to pass, that it moved with or without them. She wanted to tell him about the map, about the history her grandmother had kept hidden between pages, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the weight of too many years listening in the shadows, perhaps the fear of giving too much away. Instead, she asked him why he stayed when leaving would be easier. He looked at her, eyes steady, and said that some places call a man to stay, even when they do not want him. The days that followed carried the village into a fever of unrest. Groups formed in the square, voices rising with each telling of the same story. Some claimed the neighbor was right and that ignoring the river was folly. Others said change would unravel the very fabric of their way of life. Children whispered his name like he was a ghost, and women shook their heads when Apache passed, their eyes full of questions they would not ask aloud. Even her grandmother, though recovering, watched her with an expression that blended worry and pride, as though she knew the storm was not yet done with them. On the eve of the vote, Apache found herself cornered at the store by two elders. Spoke kindly at first, asking after her grandmother, asking if she had all the flour she needed. Then their tone shifted. They asked directly if she had walked with the neighbor by the river, if she had accepted his help at the fence, if she had eaten food from his hand. Their voices were calm, but their eyes were sharp, and Apache felt the net they were casting. She chose her words with care, saying only that she had seen his work and that it spoke louder than gossip. They did not press further, but she could tell by the way they exchanged glances that her words had placed her on one side of the line, whether she wanted it or not. That night she could not sleep. She paced the small house, listening to her grandmother's shallow breaths, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. The map lay on the table, the inked lines of rivers and hills a reminder that the land remembered more than people did. She touched the paper and wondered if she would have the courage to place it before the elders. She knew the vote would not be just about water. It would be about trust, about belonging, about whether love that dared to grow in the cracks of tradition could ever survive. When dawn came, the bell tolled low and steady, calling the village once more to the chapel. Apache walked the road with the map held close, each step heavier than the last. Families moved in the same direction, their faces pale in the early light, their voices hushed with anticipation. The neighbor walked a few paces behind, his shoulders squared, though every step seemed to cost him. The young man was already waiting at the door, his jaw set, his hands clenched. When Apache passed, he whispered her name, but she did not turn. Inside, the room was colder than before, the air tense and brittle. The elders took their seats, the pastor standing once more at their side. A hush fell over the crowd as the vote began, each elder rising to speak, each word stacking higher the walls that divided them. Some spoke of duty, others of fear, and some of the future. Then, as the moment neared for the final decision, an elder asked if anyone among the gathered wished to present evidence or speak a truth not yet heard. The silence stretched, thick as rope. Apache's heart thundered. Her hand closed around the map. She rose from her seat, the paper trembling in her grasp. All eyes turned to her, and for a moment she felt smaller than she ever had before. But then she thought of the river, of her grandmother's hands, of the quiet strength in the neighbor's eyes. She stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under her weight, and laid the map on the table. Her voice shook, but she spoke of the flood that had come long ago, of how the sandbar had been moved once before by hands no different from theirs. She said the land itself held proof that change was not betrayal but survival. The room erupted, voices clashing, some in support, others in outrage. The young man stood, his face twisted with anger, and accused her of being blinded by feelings she could not name aloud. The neighbor took a step closer, his fists clenched though his face stayed calm. The elders shouted for order, the pastor's voice rising above them all. But the noise only grew, and as the chaos swelled to its peak, as the lantern flames flickered wildly and the crowd pressed forward with the weight of their fear and hope. Colliding, Apache knew the moment had come that would decide not only the fate of the river, but the fate of her own heart. The vote had not yet been cast, but the choice was no longer just theirs. It was hers, standing on the edge of everything she had ever known, with the truth of her life hanging by a thread. The chapel shook with the noise of the crowd, until the pastor slammed his palm against the table. The sharp sound cracked through the voices, and silence spilled over the room like water dousing flame. His eyes swept the faces, steady and stern, and he told them that anger was no seed for wisdom. He lifted the map Apache had laid on the table, spreading it open so the ink lines glowed in the lantern light. He spoke of the land's memory, of the flood that had nearly erased their forefathers, of the proof that their hands had once shaped the river before. He said the map was not a stranger's story but their own. For a long time no one moved. Then one elder cleared his throat and said that perhaps survival was tradition too. Another shook his head and muttered about pride. The young man stood again, his face flushed, and declared that Apache had been led astray by feelings that clouded her loyalty. He called her blind, called her reckless, called her unfit to speak for the village. The words struck like stones, and for a moment Apache felt the room lean away from her. But then her grandmother's frail voice rose from the back. Weak but sharp, it cut through the tension. She told them all that Apache had spoken truth, that carrying two baskets meant sometimes setting down the one filled with fear. Her words carried the weight of age and memory, and no one dared silence her. The neighbor stepped forward then, his voice steady though his hands trembled at his sides. He said he would leave if that was what the vote demanded, but he would not lie about what he had seen in the river. He told them the sandbar was growing each day and that by spring the mill would stand still if nothing was done. He asked them not to trust him, but to trust their own eyes, their own past. Then he stepped back, ready for whatever judgment they cast. The final vote was taken in the quiet that followed. One by one, the elders spoke. Some clung to caution, but more than half agreed that the river must be worked, that the sandbar must be moved, that survival mattered more than suspicion. When the last elder gave his word, the pastor announced that the work would continue. Relief and unrest both rippled through the crowd, but the decision was made. The young man lowered his head, his hands shaking, and walked out without another word. Apache's chest ached as she watched him go, for though she could not give him what he wanted, she had not wished to wound him so deeply. The neighbor stayed by the door until the room emptied, then walked outside into the first thin light of morning. Apache followed, her grandmother leaning on her arm. The three of them stood together by the chapel steps as the sky turned from gray to rose. The neighbor bowed slightly to her grandmother and thanked her for speaking. The old woman smiled faintly and said that the land always remembers, and those who listen will endure. She pressed Apache's hand into his, a gesture small and quiet, but filled with meaning. The days that followed were filled with work. Men and women alike carried shovels, stones, and planks to the river. The pastor oversaw, but it was the neighbor's steady guidance that shaped the current's path. He never barked orders, never stood taller than the others, only worked beside them, showing with his hands where a stone should rest, where a board should be placed. Slowly, suspicion gave way to weary respect. The water began to shift, the sandbar breaking apart, the current flowing stronger toward the mill. The sight of it lifted the spirit of the whole village, and though no one said it outright, they all knew who had saved them. The young man did not return to the river. He kept to himself, tending his father's fields, his visits to Apache's gate ceasing. She thought of him often, remembering the kindness he had once shown, the gifts left on her step, the laughter shared at the dance. She hoped time would soften his bitterness and that he would find someone whose heart matched his own. Some endings, she learned, were not failures but paths bending away to make space for others. When the work was done and the river ran strong again, the elders called another meeting. This time their voices were calm. They agreed that the neighbor could stay if he chose, that his land was his to keep, that he had proven his worth not through words but through labor. The pastor sealed the decision with prayer, thanking the river for its lessons. For the first time, the neighbor stood among them without shadows clinging to him. He looked at Apache across the room, and though no words passed, she felt a warmth stronger than the lantern light. At home, her grandmother's strength slowly returned. One evening she asked Apache to bring the carved cross to the bedside. She held it in her thin hands and whispered that every story is written twice, once in the heart and once in the world. She told Apache that the world had seen her courage now, and it was time her heart accepted it too. Then she closed her eyes and rested, peace softening the lines of her face. Apache sat beside her, tears slipping silent, and for the first time in many weeks she felt the weight of both baskets ease. The festival came with the turning of the leaves. Lanterns lined the square, music drifted on the crisp air, and families gathered with laughter that had been absent for too long. Apache stood at the edge, watching children spin with ribbons, watching the elders nod to one another with something like pride. She thought of the night when voices had nearly torn the chapel apart and how far they had come since then. The neighbor appeared from the crowd, not at the edge this time but walking straight toward her. In his hand he carried no note, no tool, only a small wooden figure he had carved, a willow tree, its branches bending yet unbroken. He placed it in her hand and said it was not a promise but a beginning. She smiled, her heart trembling with the weight of what might grow from that beginning. As winter settled in, the river kept flowing, the mill kept turning, and the village endured. Suspicion never vanished entirely, but it no longer ruled. The neighbor became part of the rhythm, his presence no longer a shadow but a thread woven into the fabric of daily life. Apache found herself walking with him often, sharing words in the quiet between chores, laughter in the rare moments of rest, silence when silence was enough. Their bond grew not from rebellion but from trust, slow and steady, like the current reshaping the land. In time, the young man approached her again, his voice gentler. He told her he had been wrong to let anger rule him. She thanked him for his honesty and wished him peace. He nodded and said perhaps they had both carried baskets too heavy for their age. There was no bitterness in his words now, only the understanding that some paths were never meant to join. The village never forgot the night of the vote, nor the days of labor that followed. They spoke of it often, not as a story of division but as proof of what could be endured when fear gave way to truth. Apache listened, knowing the tale was larger than her, larger even than the neighbor. It was the story of a place learning to bend without breaking, of people learning to see beyond suspicion. Yet in the quiet of her own heart, she knew it was also the story of how her life had changed forever. Years later, when her grandmother's chair sat empty and the map was folded safely in a cedar box, Apache would walk the riverbank with her children. She would show them the stones placed long ago, the curve of the water shaped by many hands, and she would tell them of the night when voices clashed and truth almost drowned. She would teach them that tradition was not chains but roots, and that roots could grow deeper when stretched toward the light. She would tell them of the neighbor who became family, of the way love had once been forbidden and then became the bridge that carried them all. And when the sun dipped low, when the willow shadows touched the river, she would stand still and listen to the current. It spoke in the same voice it always had, a voice that carried memory and warning, hope and forgiveness. In its sound she heard the story of her life, of baskets carried, of choices made, of a village that endured. The story did not end with her, nor with the neighbor, nor with the river. It lived on in every heart that learned to listen. And with that, Apache's life, once bound by silence and suspicion, flowed open and free, forever changed.